Hello, and welcome to the Library Company's Fireside Chat. My name is Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am the director of the Program in Early American Economy and Society. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight for a conversation with Andrew Edwards, who is the author of this wonderful book. I don't have well, you can't see it anyway. It's called Money in the Making of the American Revolution, and the cover page was circulating before. Andrew, can you go ahead and put on your join us? There he is.
Sorry, I didn't
Um,
hear you like that. It's
no,
fine.
no. Awesome. Andrew Edwards is the lecturer in early American and economic history at the University of St. Andrews. He received his PhD at Princeton in 2018 and served as the inaugural fellow in the global history of capitalism at the Brasenose College, Oxford. Did I say that right?
Close enough.
What is it?
Brasenose College, Oxford. That's
Oh,
right.
okay. His
Yeah.
articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, Past and Present, and this is in French, and the Atelier of the École de Haute Étude, among others. He's speaking next Friday at Shear. So if you are a Shearite, please come and see his paper. I know he was also at the McNeil Center in the last year, so he comes to Philly a lot. But we owe a special debt of gratitude to Andrew because he is zooming in from Scotland, and through misunderstanding on my part, we scheduled it for the normal time on Eastern Standard Time. So he is staying up really late to talk to us, and we really appreciate it, Andrew. Uh,
Okay.
Before we
Thank
jump in, I will just say we've got a number of events coming up at the Library Company in the near future that I hope you'll join us for if you are going to be in person in Philadelphia. On Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, July 14th, Bastille Day, we'll have none other than the great Daniel Richter, who will be speaking about his new book, Native Americans and Pennsylvania. And then on Friday, if you are coming to Shear, we're having an open house to talk to Shear about what's going on with the library company. And then on July 21st, also a Tuesday, we'll have Gregory O'Malley, who will be speaking about his book, The Escapes of David George, which has already been named one of the six books to look out for by the Washington Post. I think as early as fairly early in the year, they were marking it. So it's a really interesting story of the life of David George, who was enslaved in Virginia, spent time living amongst indigenous people in the West, moved to Nova Scotia, and just circled all over the revolutionary world. So it's a perspective on the American Revolution through his life. So if you're able to join for those, I hope you will come. But for now, I have a treat for you because Andrew has written a really, I think, sort of explosive kind of a book. It's really helping us to think about the American Revolution in a new way. Um, so I wanted to get into it with you, Andrew, and talk about the book. So for starters, how did you come to this topic? What brought you to the history of money specifically and the American Revolution?
Well, first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jess. So the history of money, I came to it kind of reluctantly in a strange way. So I was a financial reporter like a long time ago in my 20s in New York City. Um, and I kind of like lived through the 2008 financial crisis. So I was, working every day, like watching the world get blown apart and economists and traders and all like sort of the best paid people in the world not knowing what they were doing. And I got really fascinated in the history of money, the history of capitalism, all this stuff. I started taking night classes at Columbia, and eventually I just decided that history was more interesting than my job. So I quit my job. I went off to Princeton for my graduate degree, and my goal was to write a history of like early American banking because the history of early American banking and this is a bit of a caricature, but like it's often told in this way by economic historians as if like sort of banks needed to exist. So they weren't like explained in the sense that they were really dramatic or transformative so much as like, in a society that like, operates on a capitalist basis, you need banks, and eventually Americans figured that out and they made a bank. And I thought the story would be a bit weirder than that. And it turns out, of course, it is. The story's in the book. because it happens in the middle of the American Revolution. But in sort of in investigating like how that transformation happened, I began just really becoming very curious, and from a complete place of naivete, I must say. I knew a lot about economic history, a lot about economics, but became really fascinated with what was going on with early American money. Because early American money, as anyone who's ever dealt with money in the 18th century knows, it's just completely bizarre. It feels really, really weird, right? Um, there's all sorts of different fights about it. There's fights about whether it should be paper, whether it should be gold and silver, whether we should be making more of it. People are always sending petitions. There's this huge political history. But it was really, really, really opaque. Even reading like the economic histories of money that sort of had been going on didn't really explain to me the fights that were happening in the middle of that moment that made the bank. So I decided what I would do, and this is the strategy I came across when I was an undergrad at Columbia, was that I would just find a crisis. I would find like a time when people had to talk about money more or less. Um, and just sort of one of the ones that occurred to me to investigate was the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. I figured
Mm.
taxes have to be paid in money. Presumably, that's not really actually the case in early America or in the early modern world more generally. But I thought, oh, okay, if there are taxes, someone's going to have to determine what the money is or the monetary form of payment, and they'll talk about it and they'll tell me about it. So I went in, I decided I was going to read the entire sort of record of like everything, the Sab in early America and all these various things, from 1764 to 1766 and just sort of figure it out. And what I was surprised by was that there was just money everywhere. Like that money was in fact all over like the central documents of the Stamp Act crisis. It was in the Stamp Act itself, it was in the appeals of the Stamp Act Congress. And then I went over to London and I went into the papers of the Treasury, and there were all these sort of like just crazy debates about, what the Americans thought money was, whether they thought it was the same thing that the British did, whether they had money on British terms, whether they didn't. There was all this crazy back and forth. But what really emerged was that, that the story that we'd been told about the Stamp Act crisis, that, more or less this idea that the taxes were so light that they couldn't have in fact been a problem, was a complete misunderstanding of the situation. And it was a misunderstanding of the situation precisely because people hadn't taken a look at sort of the monetary content of the revolutionary debates of that time. And that's just sort of started me on this journey, which led to the book.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm really enjoying getting to interview you. Sometimes I have people I've known for a long time. I've never met you before, so I did not know any of that. And it makes a lot of sense, though, both that you had a background in journalism and in finance. I would say that it's beautifully written and it's got a real rhythm to it. It's sort of a cadence to it that is not always the case in an economic history book. So it's an engaging read for those of you at home. Um, I noticed that a lot of the structure of the book and certainly individual chapters, a lot of it relies on duality. So you were discussing the debate around the Stamp Act, which was an article that you published. There's an article, like you have an article version of that that came out some time ago. But the book itself begins in the late 17th century in Massachusetts, and it really lays out kind of two fundamentally different ways of seeing money and what it means for your view about the world and about empire and economy. And you argue that the British one became naturalized over time, in the moment it was first proposed, it was actually like what was happening in America, kind of a radical, one of many possible paths. But by about 1750, by the middle of the 18th century, people forgot that that had ever been so and just took this to be, well, clearly true and natural and inevitable and all of these other things. So could you start with that duality of the way that Americans are starting to understand currency by the late 17th century, or money, I should say better, and how the British are starting to see money, that first duality that sets up the whole rest of the argument of the book.
Yeah, I mean, so the story of the Stamp Act crisis for me, so when I was thinking about the book or how I would sort of put together the book, it's like, well, the story of the Stamp Act crisis changes something fundamental about how we understand the revolution. And if that's the case, then maybe there's a story of the revolution that could be told through money in general, which is the story of the book. Um, and as I was thinking that through, I was thinking, well, and the revolution is not just like a conflict between, an empire and its colonies or, a civil war within the empire. It's also a conflict between these two different monies. And if you want to think about those two different monies, you have to think about where they diverged, right? So I call this in the book, I call this the Atlantic divergence. So in the 17th century, British money was kind of up in the air. There was all these crazy ideas. There's this incredible book by Horsfield, which is about early British monetary experiments in the 17th century. Dror Goldberg's recent book also has a lot of this stuff. But basically, people are just thinking through all sorts of crazy ideas about how they could figure out how to make more currency in a world where it looked like they just had no control over the fact that the silver that was passing through on the way from America on its way to China and India, they just couldn't get hold of it. So, well, like, what are they going to do? Um, so there was all these different experiments, but it turned out that in the 1690s and in 1690, in particular, Massachusetts, 1694, in Britain, the two different sides of the British North Atlantic chose just very different paths towards more or less trying to solve the same sort of problem, which is like the scarcity of silver currency. So in Massachusetts, they decided they wanted to create this thing called the Bill of Credit, which we could go into the actual story of like how it gets done. But the basic idea of it was, and it was from this individual by the name of John Blackwell, who's just a fascinating sort of, zealot of 17th century Republican radicalism. But he basically had this idea that money in its, essence, so to speak, was not an object. It wasn't a thing. It was a relationship between people. He calls it a mere relation, and in particular, a relationship between people and their government. And because it was a mere relation, there's no way that it could be scarce, right? Theoretically, no way that it can be scarce. Yeah. Am I getting too detailed here?
No, 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 you're
Sorry,
doing
Jessica.
great. You're doing great. I just wanted to jump in because as some people on this Zoom may know about a little bit about the history of early modern England and America and know that so much of the world operated through this kind of credit that you're describing, credits among people where, I want to buy something from you. Neither of us has currency. So a tick in your ledger says that I owe you a certain amount. And eventually that tick will get registered in mine because you'll give me something back. Or like it's not even a barter economy. It's really a credit economy where we're all writing down our ticks against everybody else, and then eventually it all kind of comes together. And so this the kind of bill of credit you're describing is building, you say in the book, I'm not intervening here, I'm reflecting back what you say, is building on that a deep-rooted household-based credit sort of relationships that people and network of relationships that people have. And what you're describing is one between people then toward their governments. So
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
all I was going.
I mean that was Blackwell's essential insight, and this I think why he got people to agree with him in early Massachusetts is like why don't we extend the system of household credit to a relationship between the citizens and the state, where what we do is we pass a tax that's a debt that's owed by the citizens. That debt, in double entry bookkeeping creates an equal and opposite credit. That credit could then be, created in physical form. That's why they called it a bill of credit. It could circulate, it could be used to pay taxes. Once the taxes were paid, it would all sort of come back together. The debt and the credit would cancel each other out, and then they would, in fact, just burn all of the money that they had just made. It was this sort of temporary thing circulating for state purposes. And I mean,
And here I want to jump in
yeah,
again.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
because I think one of the things you're so good about in this book is really emphasizing the materiality of the money itself. Like we all know about the silver and the desire for coin, but again, it's like it's vanishingly scarce. It's just really not in the American economy in any kind of quantity, and that becomes even more true over time for various reasons. But the materiality of the money itself, like I knew that they sank bills of credit, but I didn't really understand until I read this book what we're talking about a very temporary currency that is meant to be eventually used to pay my taxes. Like for a year or two, I could use it to settle debts because the other people in my local community also will owe the same taxes eventually that I will. And this bill is good for paying your taxes to the state. I live in Pennsylvania, state, the colony of Pennsylvania. Um, and so I will accept it from you and you'll accept it from me if I pay it to you. So it works like currency, but what it really is an IOU that we will eventually give back to the government. And when we do, they'll burn it. So it's not going to be, it's not money like we're used to today. It's not something that you keep in your bank account for as long as you want. You spend when you want. You can use it wherever you want. It's quite locally created, and it's and again, like the materiality of it, I think is one of the things that's so fascinating about the way what I learned from reading your book.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's exactly right. I mean, the thing I opened the book with this, as you know, but like the thing I initially didn't think this was that weird, to be honest, until it struck me like its structural significance. But like the fact that they burn their money is just so absolutely bizarre from a modern perspective. I mean, when I give my book talk, I open with this Scottish sort of band called the KLF, which you will never have heard of. Like British people, slightly older than us, have heard of it, but yeah. But anyway, like so famous, they were like the number one selling singles act of 1991, and they made 1.8 million pounds from their last single because back then that was a real industry, the music industry. They paid their taxes, 800,000 pounds. They had £1 million left over. They didn't know what to do, so they decided that they would withdraw it from the bank and take it out to the Isle of Jura, which is a little island in the middle of nowhere in Scotland, and they would burn it. And they did, and they filmed a movie of it. You can see it on YouTube. And this is what I show in my slides, is like of these guys just sort of like shoveling 50-pound notes into the fire. Um, anyway, so they toured with this movie for a little bit afterwards, and it turned out that all the audiences members that they saw just got like really, really angry with them. They're like, why didn't you give it to the NHS? Like, why didn't you give it to, why didn't you do anything good with it whatsoever? But the reason that I show that, like in my talk, is like, it's like a radical thing nowadays to burn money. It's illegal in the United States. It's like very much frowned upon here. But back then it was just like, it was sort of how they did business. Like the debits, the credits, they canceled each other out. It's gone. And that's like a one way I think, or it's a good way I feel like, I hope, to get at the how radically distinct money was at that in that moment, at least that their particular form of money.
Well, I keep interrupting you. I had originally asked about the duality. So we've got the American side. They've come up with this temporary currency that is a debit that will eventually be paid back and then burned. And then the next time they need to raise money, they'll do it again. And so you'll have these short-term emissions, is the word I'm familiar with, at least, of these
Yeah,
currencies. And so this is what they're doing. They start in Massachusetts, but gradually all the other colonies, one by one, have some version of this. Some of them here in Pennsylvania, we have a land bank. It's a little bit different, but it's the same idea that it'll eventually be burned. Um, but England is doing something very different. So what's the first duality that's setting us up? On the one hand, we have this temporary currency. What's happening?
right.
England also has
So
a problem with scarcity of silver. What are they doing?
yeah. So they're in this problem where William of Orange comes in and immediately goes to war with everybody in Catholic Europe. They start taxing everybody in order to pay for these wars. The taxes get paid in silver coin, and then they take it to Europe and they try to pay for things with this silver coin. And it turns out that it's all been chopped and sponged and squished and all this different stuff. And once again, it's this materiality problem, like the materiality of English currency, because they're at war, like all over Europe and all over the world in that moment. They realize that their materiality is lacking. And so they go the completely opposite way with it. So where the Americans, to solve the scarcity problem, are like, hey, it's a relationship, it's not an object. The British decide like, no, no, no. Well, we need this object. We need it to fight wars. We need it to fight wars abroad. So what we're going to do is we're going to recoin all of our currency at an older, heavier weight than the weight that currently exists because it's all been worn down. This is the Great Recoinage, which is, something monetary historians are always very excited about. And then we're going to create a bank. So the bank is going to, in theory, well, I mean, in practice, but initially in theory, have a currency which is based on this heavy silver coin, but it'll be able to issue bank notes backed by that silver coin. So we're all sort of, well, financial historians are all very aware of this idea of like fractional reserve banking. So you can have less coin in the bank than you have notes circulating as long as there's enough coin so that when people show up at the bank, they can exchange it for coin. And that's their way of solving the problem. But the real distinction between the two, the rub between the two, is that for the Americans, it creates this like very sort of obviously state-centric, temporary, sort of flimsy, but powerful in its way institution. And the British, on the other hand, are remaking money to be permanent, to be real, directly related to this particular physical object, which is these silver coins. And building this massive financial apparatus around that theoretically permanent money. So vastly increasing government debt, at the same time, sort of vastly expanding the private financial universe in Britain, which relies on this currency to sort of index its value. So this is what's called the financial revolution. Um, and I think that people knew, I think, in a sense, that America was doing something very different from what Britain was doing in that moment. But what's really fascinating about it, and this goes to the Stamp Act piece I was talking into the revolution itself, is that there's this moment where they just sort of collide and they sort of explosively interact with each other, which is a fascinating thing.
Well, right. So let's get into that because you said, you talk about the two financial revolutions, like again, this duality that you see in many of these chapters, where you're getting into kind of the period as the 7 Years' War is ending in North America, it's still going elsewhere in the world, but Virginia is sort of drawn into finally having to get into this paper currency where it hasn't had to do it before. And just by the luck of the draw, kind of draws the attention of the Board of Trade and the British Ministry, and we're off to the races. But a number of people who are really wedded to this idea of money is an object even though it doesn't really make sense because we all like because silver can be clipped and it can be degraded and worn down and all the things that happen, but they still have this idea of it notionally as this like pure thing that is an object rather than a measure of it doesn't it we don't actually have to exchange anything. It's just sort of a register, a mechanism for remembering how much I owe you or the other way around. And and then we get into this this ministerial project to get the American colonies in line. They come to see the paper currency not as a local um, workaround for the problem of the absence of silver. They come to see it as pernicious and undermining the empire, as a cheat, as fraud. So what's going on in the 1760s to get us to this point? And then why is the Stamp Act so important as a marker of, when the British are really laying down the law on this?
Well, I mean, so the fascinating thing about this is there's like a million different answers to that question, like what's going on in that particular moment of 1763. And I know we both really love the Earl of Hillsborough, Wills Hill. And in some ways it's like one of these strange things where it's like what's going on in his mind is what's of particular interest, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, like in general, what's happening is in 1763, Grenville and the sort of the post-war generation of British ministers come in and they really are thinking through the problem of like how do we create an imperial machine? They actually like use that language. Like how do we create a system that's going to make America useful to Britain on the one hand, but also sort of like, interact positively or like usefully with new holdings in India and in general, just sort of like around the world. Like, how do we create a global empire, right? That's a problem. And that what's really fascinating about it is not just that there's this whole idea that they got the empire in a fit of absence of mind. Well, maybe that's true for certain generations, but in this generation, they're like, no, 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 we need to think through it. We need to make an empire. And that's why when this sort of when the bills of credit come to the attention of the boards of trade, which is being headed by Hillsborough in that particular moment, I think it's why he gets upset about it. He's like, this is in fact an institution, this early American currency, this bills of credit, which is going to create a threat to our ability to sell goods to America and receive money in return that we think is valuable. I think that's why he's so upset about it. I mean, he gets into the theory of it. He's sort of obsessed with monetary theory, which is why I sort of love him. But in general, I think that's what he sees as the big problem. It's like this is a threat to America as a good market for tea, for silk, for whatever it is we're going to sell them, right? So he gets upset. Yeah.
Oh, I was just, no, you finish your sentence.
No, no, that's it. He gets really upset about it. And so he writes this policy memo in which he says that the bills of credit are a fraud. And this becomes an issue because of like at that exact same moment, and this is another one of those weird coincidental situations. A group of different Americans, so Benjamin Franklin is involved, there's other sorts of people involved, are trying at that moment to create a continental version of the bill of credit. And they think, okay, well, it's a continental version of a bill of credit. In order to have a continental bill of credit, you're going to have a continental tax. So these two plans are sent to the Treasury. One for a continental bill of credit, another one for a stamp tax, which is going to back it. The Treasury gets very excited about the idea of a stamp act. And because of this sort of thinking that Hillsborough had been going through, toss out the idea of a continental bill of credit. But then they have the problem of like what they're going to tax it in. They can't tax it in the currency that money that Americans have. They know that Americans are rich. There's all sorts of people who've been going back and forth over the course of the Seven Years' War. In general, Americans are very prosperous. They figure they can get their hands on silver even if they don't have it. So they just make a go of it. Like if we're going to tax America, we're going to have to tax them in silver, which is like this global currency, which is just as recognizable on one side of the Atlantic as it is on the other, and that just ends up blowing up in their faces.
Right. So you talk in the book about the original idea for the Stamp Act came from this guy I had never heard of, Henry McCullough, who, is this Irishman hanging out and like writing ideas down that mainly get ignored. Except for this one, he comes up with this idea. He's like, "Oh, we could have a Stamp Act for the colonies because we have one here in England, and only fair and some other things. Like it's more than that. I'm summarizing really a great deal, but he pairs it with another piece. He says, but they're going to need to be able to pay for it. And so like we have to have a plan in place for there to be enough currency for them to be able to pay the Stamp Act. So when the Stamp Act actually comes to be passed by the ministry, they leave out that part. They just do the part where there's the tax. And like you're saying, they are well aware that the Americans are in fact very prosperous. They have plenty to eat. Their clothes are in pretty good shape. Like by and large, there are few Americans who reach the kind of highest echelons of what you can find in Britain, but there are very few who reach the lows that you can find in Britain either. The vast, and if you don't include enslaved people, a very important caveat. Um, so like for free people, which is all they're really judging on, the range is pretty good. And so they think, okay, they're lying to us. They can get silver. We're going to give them this tax. We're going to be very clear that it must be paid in silver, and they're going to figure it out. However, there is no silver because one of the things you say in the book is that Grenville has made it, Grenville, the same minister who passed the Stamp Act, has actually already made it impossible for there to be any silver. What's going on there?
So, I mean, so Grenville, once again, this is part of like this great sort of systemic reform that he's going through. One of the things he's really obsessed with is the idea that in general, all the American colonies, so we're talking about the colonies in the Caribbean as well as colonies in mainland North America, all of like sort of the Atlantic colonies, if you will, are collecting less in customs revenue than it's actually paying to collect the customs. So that's like sort of that's the original sin of America of Grenville's reform program. And so one aspect of how he's going to change that, which is really familiar to early Americanists, though it happens and becomes significant first in the Caribbean, is that he actually enrolls all of the captains in the British Navy in the U.S. in the sorry, the U.S. the U.K. Customs Service, not the U.K. either, the British Customs Service. So what that means is that, British naval captains, if they catch someone smuggling, like they might be in for a cut if the thing is actually condemned and then auctioned off, right? So they become very, very excited. And in particular, what they do is they cut off the trade between Spanish colonies and the mainland of sort of, whatever you want to call it, Central America and Jamaica. And it's that trade, the Spanish trade, which has been providing all of the silver to the British Caribbean that Americans had historically had access to. Now, the Americans didn't have access to it in the sense that they used much of it for circulating currency in North America. But what they did do is they used it to pay off British creditors. And this was, in fact, the source that Grenville was sort of thinking of. If he was thinking of it, if they don't have silver, they could get it. But the only place they could get it was the British Caribbean, which he had cut off by, empowering the British Navy to be these sort of like I don't know what you want to call it, sort of like customs enforcement, Inspector Javert of the Caribbean.
So he's cut off the flow of silver and said, you must pay in silver. And the Stamp Act we know gets fairly quickly defeated. The American colonists are like, they're kind of in a bind. They're making two sets of arguments. They're saying, we have no silver, we cannot pay. And they're also starting to make constitutional arguments. They're trying to say this is not only can we not do it, it's wrong. And so they're kind of being backed into a corner as they're trying to explain their monetary system, which the British just fundamentally don't understand. They're getting into constitutional arguments, which are about not just the sovereignty over assessing a tax, but you're arguing that they're really getting at the sovereignty to decide what money is and how you will frame a local economy. So pretty quickly, the Stamp Act is repealed because enough British observers are convinced that Grenville is wrong and there is no silver, and it's partly his own fault, and they say this. And so they say, okay, we're not doing that. But we are going to pass the Declaratory Act in 1766, which says Parliament has the right to legislate in all cases whatsoever. Colonies mainly ignore that and are like, oh yeah, whatever, sour grapes. And and we go forward. And you talk about the 10 tone duties, but it's really the next really big incident comes around the tea, which is mainly, and we don't need to go into it. You go into it beautifully in your book, actually, about how and why they are trying to save the East India Company by their actions in the Tea Act. It's not directed at the colonists in a direct way at all. It's kind of like collateral that it affects them. Um, but the colonists respond to this one again really negatively. Can you explain what's going on and like how we're getting to the actual timing now of the American Revolution?
Yeah, I mean, to me, like there's like the sort of the years between. So my main character here is John Dickinson, who you already sort of brought up, and I dearly love because he's sort of weird. He's very much like the guy who's writing about silver. He writes the most beautiful pamphlet explaining why Americans cannot physically pay the Stamp Act, which has been often overlooked in that sort of the histories of the Stamp Act that came before mine. So I tried to give that a lot of prominence. But he also has this insight that, if they can cost like what the Stamp Act does, the resistance to the Stamp Act shows is that for Americans to protect their rights, and then this might be, include rights to enslaved people. It's just basically the rights to arrange a local political economy. That they're going to have to create something like a continental politics. They're going to have a way of thinking through their rights within the empire, which protects local rights to arrange property. And this becomes extraordinarily influential through obviously his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. But it becomes explosive, right, in that moment around the tea because, when Americans are resisting the Tea Act, so, we could go into what the Tea Act is if you want, but the main point, and we all know about this Boston Harbor, but of course, there are tea ships which are turned away from Philadelphia, and there's resistance all sort of up and down the eastern seaboard when they're resisting it, I don't think in that moment that they thought they were doing anything particularly explosive. I think they thought that in a sense, it was a continuity. I mean, maybe in a sense, there was because of the various coercive measures that have been put on Massachusetts and New York over the course of this period, they knew that there could be more serious consequences. But the real issue, and this is what I argue in the book, and I think it's true, is that it was so explosive from the perspective of the British, much more so than the Americans. Because from the British perspective, from the American perspective, throwing the tea in the harbor was trying to resist in order to sort of maintain the basis for this continental politics, the continental congresses and the committees of correspondence and all these different things we're trying to build in this moment. From the British perspective, throwing the tea in the harbor meant that Americans were rejecting their role for it, that the Britain had actually made for them in that post-war, post-7 Year War order, which was that Americans were meant to be good consumers of British goods. And if they were throwing those goods into the harbor because of whatever their political rights, things that they didn't actually recognize as significant in the first place, then they had a real problem. They had a problem that was actually going to lead to Britain, in fact, going to war with Massachusetts, and then, of course, sparking the Revolutionary War in general. But it's the British, I think, who have that realization that what the Americans are doing, it's not just that they're, they have, different feelings about the Constitution or their rights, but they have a very different sense of like how this empire is going to work. From the British perspective, they're like, we need to arrange the empire for our own benefit, and you guys are lucky to come along for the ride for us. I mean, they're interested in the Americans, but they're not like most interested. And the Americans, have a very sort of localized view, and those things just sort of, obviously come into a conflagration with when the shooting starts in 1775.
All right, so we're in the revolution now, and so your book is divided into three parts, and this part is called the double revolution. And that's how you start. You say it consisted of two interrelated projects. We might call this America's double revolution. And you say one of them was political, and that's the one people are more familiar with. But the second project was monetary, and that, in essence, and this will make sense to anyone who knows anything about how the world works, you cannot make war if you do not have money. And some way of paying the soldiers and getting the supplies and doing all of the things that are necessary to field an army over what is ultimately going to be a period of 7 years, which I mean they don't know that in 1776, but the reason they've ever been emitting currency in the first place was for wars. So I mean, this is the problem. How do you mobilize the collective wealth of the population for a project, a short-term project like a war? Like there are roads or other kinds of infrastructure things, but the big thing that governments really have to get their act together to fund is a war. And so you make a big deal about how constitutive monetary policy is in the creation, not just of the revolution, but of the United States itself. So like, we know about the one revolution, we don't need to focus so much on that, but that second part of the dual revolution, the monetary revolution, what's happening there? How are they approaching the problem? And well, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so the fascinating thing is like, well, I mean, what I say in the book is that, money was the first thing that Americans did together, which is kind of a fascinating thing to me. Because in that moment, so 1775, April 1775, we know this story, there's this sort of like there's this conflagration, colony after colony after colony raises an army. There's suddenly, a besieging force around Boston. George Washington is riding north. There's all these things going on. But behind that, every single one of those colonies has to deal with the problem of how we're going to pay for it. And every single one of them turns to bills of credit. They turn to this temporary money. I mean, I don't think it's going too far to say that if the Americans had had something like the British mindset about money going into 1775, it would have been impossible to finance the war. It particularly would have been impossible to finance those first crucial years of the war because there would have been no way to pay for it. Like literally, there would have been no way. But because they developed, this particular tool in extremis in the sense, like going back to the 17th century, they could deploy it, And so what I do is I walk through every single colony doing this, and it's the first thing they do because you have to raise money, then you get the troops. But what I also found was fascinating is the way that they're like working together and they're writing back and forth, and they're like, we don't actually remember how to make it because like they hadn't made it since the 7 Years' War, and like and New England had restrictions on it for a really long time, and so there's this sort of like interplay, like how do we make this money, right? In the same time that they're trying to figure out like that second problem, like how do we make this government? How do we make this army, right? And those two things are interacting with each other like really dynamically.
Sorry. New York doesn't emit its currency. It says, look, we're in the middle of all of this geographically. We have all kinds of there's a lot of stuff going on that makes it so that we don't think we should be the one to emit the currency. We think that you, Congress, should emit a currency. And Congress says, okay, great idea. Let's do this. And they call it the Continental. And you, I've got to say, because even though I run a program in early American economy, I am not well read or have not worked deeply in the finance and the monetary policy of the American Revolution. The stereotype of the Continental is that not worth a continental, right? Like this idea that that they overprinted. They made too many continental dollars, and so they just flood the market. And when you do that with a currency, it devalues the currency. And so the continental had no one had faith in it because there were too many of them, and it failed. You have a really different story about what's happening with the continental and why it's doing okay for a little bit and then it's not, but not in the time frame that, or like sort of not for the reasons people have traditionally taught, certainly, or read in their history books, and not on the timing that people necessarily think. Like they think like, oh, it's because they're overprinting. But the continental, you're arguing the continental, they're starting to overprint it because it's failing, not the other way around. Can you explain why, what's going on with the continental? Why have we misunderstood?
I mean, it's such a fascinating, crazy story. I mean, if anyone is first of all like an economist or an economic historian and interested in this, I highly recommend Farley Grubb's book on the continental dollar, which is like a technical economic, I don't know, forensic accounting of the continental dollar, which is absolutely fascinating. Um, and Farley has been really influential on everything that I've done. But the main point is this, like the idea that, the Continental was overprinted and that causes devaluation, while it's sort of true in the later years, cannot have been the case early on. Early on, Americans are printing the money, and yet the first moment where the Continental sort of dips in value in the Philadelphia market, which is where we have the most sort of documented time series of the value of the Continental, is in the late 1776. And it's in late 1776 not because they've overprinted or anything like that. It's because the British Army has invaded New York, has conquered Long Island, and is coming across New Jersey. And in doing so, it has wiped out these massive sort of regions, which the Continental Congress, for Continental Congress is fleeing Philadelphia. They're terrified. They're worried that this war is over before it's begun. But that also has an effect on the currency because the currency relies on, for its solidity, for its value, on the sense that people are going to have to pay their taxes in it later on, that there's this credit and there's also this debit, and the two things are going to interact. So when the British Army threatens the ability to pay taxes, that's where it dips. And that, in fact, is the beginning of this process, where it is the challenge to American sovereignty, which becomes a challenge for the currency, which then leads to more and more and more and more printing, and then eventually to, Americans abandoning the project of temporary money for good.
Right. Right. No, and I think you put it really well because you start that chapter by talking about the invasion of Canada, which doesn't go well. And one of the things that goes wrong among many is that Canadians are not willing to take the continental dollar because they don't think it's going to be useful to them at some point. And that's the real limitation of this currency. It's very based in that particular polity to being able to pay taxes or having to pay taxes in that particular polity. And then what you say is, when the British Army takes New York, when they take Philadelphia, when they're in the South, as they take all these different cities, they make those places into Canada from the standpoint of money. Where why would you take that money in New Jersey or the hinterlands of Philadelphia if you're not sure that it's going to have a purpose down the line? You're not going to be able to use it. So it's really falling apart, and they try some other stopgap measures. They try to figure out how to um, float the continental dollar. They try taxing more, which ironically is like a way of getting the continental dollar back. It doesn't work. What do they finally do? Because in the end, you say perniciously, the British lose the American colonies, but the British win the argument about what money is and how you get it. So what is ultimately the way that the Americans figure out to finance the war?
So yeah, finally we're arriving like, where I began the book, which is that problem of like American banking and American finance. It's like basically everyone who is in George Washington's tent during the Revolutionary period, like in New Jersey or outside Philadelphia, becomes deeply disillusioned with bills of credit because people are not willing to accept it and precisely the way you're talking about, because these areas have become Canada or in New Jersey or like Connecticut because they had so many continental dollars already because the prices had driven up and because more and more and more and more are being printed that people are like, I could pay taxes for 100 years with the continentals I already have. Like I don't need this, right? But from the perspective of someone who's, trying to feed a starving army, right? Like that sort of like rational retreat from the continental dollar is it feels like a betrayal. And they begin thinking through, so Alexander Hamilton's one of these people, but a lot of different people begin thinking through, like, how can we rearrange money such that we are never vulnerable in the same way that we are now? And the obvious model is to do what the British had done, nearly a century before, to create a bank which is backed by a permanent, solid, like theoretically, infinitely lasting form of money, a store of value in the sort of typical economic terms, which a coin represents, right? And so, in the middle of, there's a huge crisis which precipitates it, and like Tom Paine and all these really interesting people are involved. They found the first chartered bank in what's becoming the United States or in the North American colonies in Philadelphia, the Bank of Pennsylvania, then the Bank of North America, as it's called. And they set out not just like, making the bank as an alternative form of currency, but using it as an engine to transform the way money works, because that's what they need. That's what they need in order to feed the army, right? Um, and which is, of course, a project which continues after the revolution when all these bills of credit starts cropping up in the states.
Right, which then gets us into the Constitution and kind of the conclusion of your book, which is mainly about the revolution. So that's a very small part of the overall book. But right, so this is sort of how centering money, the materiality of the money, the problem of money. Why would you burn the money? That's how you start. You say this is the burning question. Why are you burning the money, and what does that mean for the way you understand what money even is, and how it fits in an imperial project, and how differently aligned the American form of money is from the British one, and that the revolution is the product of this clash between, I should go on record, I am not a Hillsborough fan. um, of people like Hillsborough who are just like bound and determined they're going to make this happen, and it pushes the colonies in Britain into a level of disagreement that ends in violence and civil war, and then ultimately independence. So, so that's kind of the book in a nutshell. We have our first question, so I'll go ahead and turn to it. We're going to spend the remainder of the time, if I can keep asking Andrew questions, but if you have questions, please pop them into the question and answer chat, and I will ask them to him, and we will build on your questions. So I apologize, I might mispronounce this name. It's Bonnie Zetic or Zetic. To what extent did personal wealth affect the role of colonists participating in the war, such as promotions, assignments, resources provided to help individuals carry out their responsibilities?
I don't know. I mean, that's a really fascinating question. Um, I mean, one of the fascinating things about is it okay if I turn it back to revolutionary money? I like one of the fascinating things about the bills of credit is that it doesn't rely on wealthy people to make it work. Like it's a relationship between the community and between the state, which in a sense, like, creates problems for wealthy people because wealthy people are going to have to pay the taxes, but it's typically poor people. So it's these soldiers, it's all these different people who are going to be involved in the supply of the army, who may be middling or whatever, but these aren't like super wealthy people to begin with, who are going to be circulating the bills of credit, receiving them from the state, and then demanding things from the rich that they're going to use, right? So in a sense, like it creates this sort of like bottom up economic ferment in which all sorts of different people can rise. I mean, like famously, that's the story of Alexander Hamilton, which is not a monetary story per se, but it's a monetary basis for that story, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, and in the middle of the war, like, Thomas Paine, when he's trying to help create this bank, so he's one of the original people who think that like a British model is where America should go. Um, You're not particularly well known for that, of course, but we all know Paine for what he is well known for. He says that, when we change over the British model, The main downside is this, is that suddenly like poor people are not going to be equal to rich people when it comes to the financing of government.
Mm,
Wealthy people, in fact, will have to be considered in a way that's going to give them much more power within the governmental system. And that transformation he sees, and this is like in the moment of the birth of American finance, as being really crucial to the transformation that he also feels is necessary, right? So he feels like it's a downside. We're losing, in a sense, like the democratic basis of American political economy. But on the other hand, that's what we need, right? So it does change who's in charge. I mean, after the revolution, there's the birth of, people start using this term, which was from earlier in the 18th century in the British context of the moneyed interest, and that comes into being. And inequality becomes, associated with power in a new way. Not that it wasn't
mhm,
before, but in a transformed sense.
mhm. Right. And I think that's one of the things your book is so interesting about is the way that kind of revolutionary theory and small r Republican theory is entwined with this political moment of understanding that money is inherently political. It's not natural. It's not inevitable. It's a creation that people make and therefore that communities make, which makes it a political decision. And the political decisions around it in the American Revolution are really fraught. And there are people like Paine who will eventually conclude that that bank gave too much power away and that it undoes so much of what made the American Revolution worthwhile in the first place. Whether or not he's right is a different question, but it's really wrapped up for them in the theory, the philosophy of why did we have a revolution at all? What does this mean? Um, anyways, all right. Thank you for that question. We have Richard Evans who asks, oh, good. Is the Currency Act of 1764 an attempt to align the currency of the colonies to what the British view of the currency? Richard Evans has clearly been listening very well.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, so the Currency Act of 1764 it was initiated by Hillsborough's policy memo, which we already talked about a little bit earlier. Hillsborough wanted to take it much further. He wanted to ban bills of credit. He wanted to get rid of them. He thought they were a fraud against the body public. He thought they were a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. There were people in Parliament, however, who knew better, who knew that, like, bills of credit were the way that Americans had been able to contribute militarily, in particular, to the British Empire. So what they did in 1764 is they extended like limitations on bills of credit, which had initially been on New England, to all of the colonies. And this created all sorts of like crazy problems, but the theory behind it was actually like a little bit less radical than what people were asking for because it still allowed the colonies to create bills of credit, but only with real oversight from Britain and for the most part in times of war and very limited in other ways. Yeah.
But I think, raising this act, the Currency Act, which is not one of the well-known ones, like you kind of hear about the Molasses and the Sugar Acts, which are kind of the B list things that lead to the American Revolution in most textbooks. And then the focus really then jumps to the Stamp Act, maybe the Proclamation of 1763, which closed off the West for the time being to white settlement, the Stamp Act, and then from then on, it's the taxes that go forward. I have never once seen the Currency Act brought up in like a textbook as one of the things that is restructuring the relationship of the empire and going to have these long-term effects. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about your analysis is the way that it brings us back to the Currency Act. So thank you, Richard Evans, for raising that. Yes, the Currency Act said.
I mean, for me, one of the things that really kicks off revolutionary debates is all of the things that are done around New York and the Quartering Act. But if you go into the reasons the New York legislature is, resisting providing all these things for British troops, it's because they say we don't have any way to pay for it because we aren't able to emit a currency anymore, right? So the Currency Act has all these sort of weird ramifications that go through the revolutionary crisis. Yeah.
All right. Alfred Cavallari writes, if I'm a blacksmith, oh, good. This seems like a word problem. If I am a blacksmith and sell 500 bayonets to a colonial government for 500 pounds or dollars, the government can pay me with a bill of credit in the amount of, say, $500. Then I can take that bill of credit, can buy a load of coal. How do I use it to buy lunch? Tear off a corner? Oh, so we're really getting into the materiality now.
Well, first of all, they would never have given you in that sort of denomination because the denominations are sort of like middle denominations, so they aren't super duper small, but they aren't super duper large. Like the credit, and they get smaller over the course of the crisis. But the currency they think of as like more or less like this tax payment voucher, right? So it can exist in relatively large forms and be traded in relatively large amounts, and that's not a big problem. No, the reason that's possible is because of what Jess was talking about earlier, which is this deep underlying credit economy which runs through all of these things. So if you were to buy lunch in Philadelphia, unless nobody knew you, which could be the case. So like when Benjamin Franklin shows up in Philadelphia in the early 18th century, nobody knows him, and famously, like he has some coins because he sold some like books that he had in Boston, and that's how he has to use to buy lunch. But this blacksmith, everybody would know him. They would be like, he would say, "Hey, can I get lunch?" They'd say, "Great." They'd put it in his credit in the ledger, and someday or other, that person would come by needing, horseshoes or whatever that the blacksmith does, and all of these things would sort of equal out. So the main thing is like currency, in a sense, gets removed from those day-to-day transactions for the most part.
Yeah, and I'll say if you're interested in that question of like, buying lunch in Philadelphia and tearing off a corner, I mean, one of the things that's cool, I would have loved even more of these. There are lots of images. I hope this will show up. Of nope.
I put them into the chat, actually.
Ah,
I put them in the
what?
chat. I put them in the
Oh, okay,
chat.
good, good. That'll work
Yeah,
better.
sorry, I should have told you.
Um, he has lots of wonderful images of the oh, you know what? They can't see them. I think only you and I might be able to see
Oh,
them.
I'm sorry.
But maybe Grace can repost them for us.
So
But the book has all these wonderful images of so the first page, figure one, 50 shillings in Pennsylvania, 1775. And it's this really cool image of the Pennsylvania hospital, I think. And uh Anyway, and right now, I was telling Andrew this earlier, we have up just an extraordinary exhibition that Jim Green, our librarian emeritus, put together, and um, and it includes currency, and it also includes counterfeit currency and the plates that were made to use it, so you can actually see like the size of the currency we're talking about. It's pretty small, and the kinds of things they try to do to prevent counterfeiting unsuccessfully, and the denominations, which are quite small. So you would probably, but I mean that denomination problem continues to be a problem. If you've ever been in a developing marketplace, bartering for whatever local thing, like often you want to pay with like a 10 uh, uh, trying to think of a currency off the top of my head, 10 peso note, and the store person can't break it. And so then there'll be this like complicated thing with all the other sellers to make it possible for you to buy it. Like this is still a problem in many parts of the world today. Like how you take your 500 pound note and then go buy lunch with it. Okay, it looks like maybe the files are up now, so you can see them. Oh, and if you yeah. Yeah, so figure one, the 50 shillings, that's the one I was telling you about. Oh, well, I can't open it right now. That'll be distracting, but hopefully you and the audience can. Okay. Roger Moore says the depreciation of the continental dollar was in part due to the overprinting and the redemption based on interest payment in continental dollars, which was changed to payment to silver and gold or merchandise. However, wasn't the severe counterfeiting of the continental dollar a key reason for the depreciation?
I mean, it's definitely a contributing factor. I mean, so from the minute that more or less that the British take New York, they're printing continental bills or whatever, like counterfeit continental bills, and they're saying that you can like buy them at cost at the printing office and putting it in the newspaper. And there's all if you read like the accounts of soldiers who are on the line in New Jersey, sort of like looking back at Manhattan, when they catch people coming across, like often their clothing will be stuffed with continental notes. So definitely the British thought of counterfeiting as a way to undermine the currency and therefore, undermine the army. That's definitely true. And when they capture Philadelphia in 1777, they actually get these plates that allow them to print in continental notes, once again, without any backing whatsoever. And they go berserk with it and print as many as possibly can. At one point, there's this crazy story because there's all these, people who are captured at Saratoga who get shipped off to Virginia. So these are prisoners of war. Um, and they're shipping food to them, but underneath the food is hidden just this massive pile of continental currency that the wagon, which is supposed to be bringing food to these prisoners of war, is also like distributing along the way. So the counterfeiting is definitely a thing, and it definitely undermines what's happening there. But in general, and this is just my judgment. We there are there are certain runs of counterfeit currency that, for instance, of a continental currency which just get completely wiped out because apparently they're too counterfeited from the perspective of the continental currency. But the thing that really undermines the currency is not the fact that there's more of it, though that did undermine it. It's the actual taking of Manhattan. It's the invasion of New Jersey. It's the fact that Charleston gets taken, that Savannah gets taken, that a British army is just wandering around the South, and it seems as if it cannot be stopped, making the collection of taxes impossible. And particularly, they make the collection of taxes impossible at the precise moment when the taxes are first meant to be collected. So this is in 1779. So that's when, in fact, so the first taxes which were passed in 1775, those taxes are meant to be collected in 1779. They know there's going to be a war in between, but in that precise moment is when Britain is sort of like wandering around, messing with American governments in a way that makes the collection of those taxes all but impossible. And it's that impossibility is when the news gets back, or the sort of the theory gets back to Philadelphia, that those taxes aren't going to be coming in, or they're not going to be coming in the volume that was expected, that the continental currency just collapses. Like that's the moment where it collapses. It's not the counterfeiting that stops it. It's the news that in fact those taxes will be impossible to collect.
Well, I'll come back to it, but I think this question, that's the last question we'll take because we're running over time now. But I think this one segues nicely off of what you're just saying. Ken Banks asks, what impact did the French have on finances, given that they brought both hard currency and bills of credit? And you do talk about the French coming and just being like, what is these? Okay, I have a terrible French accent. That was Transylvania. But anyway.
Uh, I mean, the French are crucial, but particularly they're crucial in making it possible for all of these disillusioned, patriot financiers, merchants and political figures to transform American currency because, it's all well and good to create a bank backed by hard currency. But if there is no hard currency, that actually is impossible. Like it becomes implausible. So what happens is that the French, very kindly agree to ship a huge amount of silver to early America. They'd been distributing silver via their armies earlier, but this is actually like a lump sum that's given, and it immediately goes into the vaults of the Bank of North America, and it's used to sort of back these new continental dollar notes. Um, so, in a sense, like, we owe our financial system to France if you wanted to overblow it. But no, they made it possible. They gave basically they created the material possibility of the financial transformation, which these revolutionary leaders thought was necessary to get through those last years of the war. So they were absolutely critical in that respect.
Thank you. All right, two last questions. Kenneth Romanowski asks, could you expound on the difficulties of accepting early American banking in light of the Articles of Confederation? So again, like this juxtaposition between a financial moment, this is a question I had, I as well, or sort of something that's percolating in my mind. The story of the Articles of Confederation government, of course, is that it was never able to pass taxes. It was never able to kind of come up with the financial wherewithal, or political wherewithal, I should say, to get the states to finance the government the way that the war effort and the government the way they wanted it to. So how is that playing into the story of the revolutionary moment? Your focus goes a different direction, but I'm wondering how that
No, I mean,
traditional story of the Articles of Confederation United States plays in.
so The Articles of Confederation story that it couldn't pass taxes. So this goes back to like Charlie Calomiris' work in the 1980s, which is really, really, really important. But it does kind of get the timing wrong because the Articles of Confederation and the inability to tax there is not the issue in 1779. It's these British armies wandering around that's causing the problem. I mean, one gets every impression that the states in that moment wanted to tax, and in fact, they did send a lot of currency into Philadelphia, but many of them were completely unable. So that wasn't a matter of like constitutional arrangement so much as it was like the fact that they were in a shooting war. But after the revolution, precisely this thing happened. So the all of a sudden the federal government has almost no power. It certainly doesn't have the power to tax. It's sort of like living on sufferance. But simultaneously, in this world where money is kind of up for grabs, like what it is, how it's going to be arranged, all the different states start arranging money in different ways. So in Philadelphia and Massachusetts, pretty soon in New York, you get these new banks being founded, right? And they're sort of like running currency one way. Simultaneously, other colonies, famously Rhode Island, but also eventually Pennsylvania and other colonies are just making new bills of credit, right? So you get these two or maybe even more different monetary systems all running against each other simultaneously, which creates all sorts of really, 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 really not necessarily violent, but like really, really upsetting political conflict, which is like the conflict that we think of in the Articles of Confederation period. This isn't all of it, but it's a huge chunk of it, is these conflicts over different kinds of money rubbing against each other, which then, in the minds of many people, leads to the necessity of a federal constitution.
Hmm. Thank you. All right, last question, which is ironic because Donald Dostie, who is the questioner, is known for asking the first question. So it's kind of fun that he's getting the last. I will just give a shout out to Donald, who is a fantastic PhD student at Temple University and a former Pease Fellow, well, a forever Pease Fellow. And he's going to be a McNeil Center Fellow this coming year. He's doing a magnificent, really fascinating dissertation on the history of privies in the early republic in Philadelphia. And that sounds a little goofy, but it's really, really not. It's so interesting. Talk about like a material history of how wealth and power and all kinds of other things work through this one space. Anyways, that's here's Donald's question. Same question I asked at your McNeil Center talk. How do we get from lack of currency to pay taxes to taking up arms? How much did this resonate with the rank and file?
Oh, I mean, okay, so there's like it's first of all, it's a really interesting question. The rank and file, as far as I can tell, are just super excited to get in the situation. They really are very interested in getting paid. They're getting paid in bills of credit. I don't think that that's what they're particularly upset about. It's not so much, and in fact, there's two different ways that we can think about the causality of the American Revolution if we're going to back it up, right? We could say that like, is this currency problem, like what percentage does it lead to the revolution, right? Like perhaps there's like a percentage which is about the constitutional thing. There's a percentage which is about, ideology. There's a percentage which is about a particular variety of Protestantism. There's a percentage, there's all these, we could think about it that way. But the way that the revolution actually happens is kind of, and this is actually why I presented it in the book, is as a narrative, it's one thing leads to another, right? So, the problem of currency, the impossibility of paying silver in 1765 isn't something that's like leading, into is not something that unless they were in fact like a very, very, very old young soldier in the trenches. Oh, sorry, in 1765, unless they, were, in their 30s or something, which most of them weren't. That's not the thing that they're remembering. What they're remembering is that in that moment, American leaders saw the impossibility of paying taxes silver as a motivating force to create a continental politics, to create a new vision of empire, to create a new vision of the British Constitution, which would make it impossible for those kind of monetary issues to ever recur again. And this is why one of the rallying cries of the revolution going into 1775, and of course even further, and we all know about it today, is no taxation without representation. Because it's that taxation power and that representation power that allows colonies to organize property, to organize money, in fact, in the ways that they want. And it's that power, in fact, that the British Army or the sort of the British government is attempting to strip or to limit or to put off in different ways that the colonies eventually find uh, unacceptable. So it's not so much that I think of it as a percentage, it's more as a crucial part of the story, which if you don't understand, you're not going to understand anything about what motivated, those people to fight, those people to work for a new independent state in the moment of independence.
I'll also add, because Andrew occasionally indulges himself in a long endnote. There's one in chapter one that goes for 3 pages, guys. It's amazing. Um, but this is the one in chapter four, which I think will be particularly helpful to many graduate students reading this, or people trying to fit it in the historiography. And it's I don't normally call out people's endnotes or footnotes or whatever, but it's number 72. It's on page 309. And basically in it, you say like, I am amplifying or sort of giving a like you are aligning with T.H. Breen's Marketplace of Revolution and with Jack Green's The Constitutional Origins of the American Revolution, essentially saying that the same kind of pocketbook concerns that Breen recognized in the way that people came together over the materiality of being able to protest goods together, in a similar way, like this, the materiality of the money problem is also connecting them. So it's sort of like it's building on, and it's not disagreeing with Breen. It's saying you're even more right than you realized, actually, because there's this other side to it. And then with Green, and his emphasis on the constitutional arguments, you say he was surely correct. My point is to show that the constitutional dispute had its origins in the problem of money. So like you're not disagreeing necessarily with some of the major works that have come along about the history of the American Revolution. You are uh, building your own story by centering one particular part of it, which is the financial
Yeah,
part
I
of
mean,
it. So this is why we read endnotes, guys.
absolutely. And those are crucial. I mean, yeah, so that's absolutely what I think. For me, like understanding this money problem, it's weird because money feels like a very niche and a very strange sort of thing. It's weird that it has this outsized power at particular moments in history, in particular moments in the sort of revolutionary struggle. So by like following the thread of money through the whole story, I don't want to say that money is the entire story, just that it interacts in really crucial ways at various moments throughout this entire thing. On the one hand, and then on the second, um, there is something about money itself, and it's what you were talking about earlier, Jess, this idea like that money, in fact, is a political thing, which lends itself to this kind of, I don't know, blue sky, constitutional thinking. And I think like is in fact what is so inspirational to so many of these different figures is that it kind of creates the scale. Like this is the kind of power that we need to think through, right? The kind of power that we have right now as colonies, but also the kind of power that Britain's exerting on us, right? And money, because of its political nature, is like particularly, I don't know, volatile in that way.
Hmm. And we're living through a modern moment where we're playing with that in new ways. So it really like the timing of the book, um, and you being, its origins in the 2008 financial recession. I think anyway, we are living through a lot of the in real time the connections between what is currency, what is it? Is it a thing? Is it a measure? What is its relationship to a polity? A sovereign nation and to sovereignty and all kinds of other questions. And you're showing a long history of it going back to the American Revolution. So I have kept you up until past 1 in the morning. I am so impressed with your ability to be gracious and erudite at such a late hour. Thank you. And I'm sure everyone at home is clapping. I will be the stand-in clapper for the group to say thank you for this. Thank you for this really fascinating read. I really did enjoy reading it. I highly recommend it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about it.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and I hope I get to see a bunch of you next week. Next week? Is it next week? In
It is.
Philadelphia?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Next
yeah.
week.
I know it
Just,
just feels like completely insane. It's like next week, but also on another continent. So,
yeah.
it's pretty
Well.
extreme.
We'll see some of you in Philadelphia next week. Looking forward to it. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you at a future fireside chat.
Thank you all. Bye bye.
Bye.